What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a 2006 Porsche Cayman 987. Today on the 987 behind me, we're going to be covering a couple things. In front of us we have a water pump kit, which includes the new water pump, the gasket, the bolts, as well as a gallon of genuine Porsche coolant. We have also added a serpentine belt kit, or at least most of it. This is a Continental kit, comes with a new belt as well as the idler pulleys. We're going to be replacing them while we're in there. The car has 98,000 miles. More than likely they've never been replaced, and Porsche recommends you do a belt check every 40,000 miles, but a replacement every 60,000 miles. And along with that, we have also added a thermostat. Since we're going to be servicing the cooling system, you always want to do the pump and the thermostat together at the same time if possible. So we have a new thermostat with a new gasket that we will also be replacing. There's no service records for this car ever having the service done before, so more than likely we're going to be dealing with original parts today. The water pump does not have a, if you will, a actual interval. Truly what you want to look for is just obvious signs. The pump either can start to leak, the weep hole starts to leak, the bearing starts to go bad and it starts to get a little bit noisy, and in extreme cases the impeller fails and your car overheats. So if you want to be ahead of the ball here, every 60,000 miles when you're doing your belt is a great time. In this case, this car went to almost 100,000 miles with no problems, maybe every 100K. Truly depends on the vehicle and the way you drive it, but just keep that in mind. 60K is a safe interval. That's not to say that they can't fail earlier than that and or last longer than that. But before we get started on this DIY, we just want to make a mention that this is going to cover your .1 models. So this is the 3.4 liter behind us. It's an S model, so just keep that in mind for those of you looking out there. We also have 996 water pump thermostat DIYs and 997.2 thermostat water pump and DIYs. But with that, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. For this job, you're going to need a torque wrench, anything that can handle 8 Newton meters all the way to 60 Newton meters. In our case, we're going to be using a 1/2 inch torque wrench for our 24 millimeter socket, as that's the only 1/2 inch 24 we have. You may want to use a 3/8 if possible, so you can just stick to one torque wrench. So you can see we have both 1/2 inch ratchet, 3/8 and a 1/4 inch. Just we're going to be mixing and matching some of the sockets we have here. A couple different extensions. We have these extensions here that have a bit of a wobble head. These come in really handy when you want to use a socket without a swivel end on it. So gives you a little bit of play. So we're going to try this along with a swivel adapter for our 1/4 inch stuff. We also have a small 3-inch for our 3/8 drive stuff. Speaking of sockets, we have a 24 mil, a 10 mil. Some specialty ones is an E14, E12, E10. We have an M8 triple square, a T30, a T25. We have some pliers for our hose clamps. We have a 15 millimeter and a 16 millimeter wrench, a small pry bar and screwdriver. We have some torque seal. You can use a paint pen as well for the hardware once you've torqued everything down. We have a small trim removal tool to get the carpet up inside the car. We have some medium strength thread locker. We're going to be reusing the bolt for our main tensioner pulley, just because you'd have to remove a lot of things to get to the back bolt to get it out, and it's not typically something you do every time you do the belt. Maybe the second or third time you do the belt, you can do the job in full. We have a small electric ratchet to help speed up the removal and install of our hardware. We have our vacuum fill tool for our coolant, which is also linked in the description below, and not pictured here but needed, a couple flashlights and a catch can for all your coolant. Now with that, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, we're going to start in the back of the Cayman. We're going to be removing our engine cover. This will give us access to our expansion tank at the end of this job. That's pretty much it. We don't really need to do too much else in this area. So we'll start by removing the carpeting first, insulation, and then our heat shield. Just be mindful when you're working over the hips of the 987. You have some soft clothing on. You don't want to mar up your paint. Pretty hard to avoid leaning on the side of the car here, so just keep that in mind. Small trim removal tool just to kind of lift up the carpet, get it popped up. This is going to give us access to our T30s underneath. With the insulation / carpeting off, we have access to the 5 T30s that hold this engine cover down. 3 up top, 2 down at the bottom. And with this off, we can set this to the side. And we have a nice clear view of our expansion tank up here. Hopefully your engine looks a little bit nicer than this one, but we're not here to judge today. We're just here to work. With our cover off, we're gonna work on removing this bar up here. This is gonna hold down some of this plastic trim here that we're gonna need to pop up so that we can get our carpeting off to access our belt. Belt's gonna have to come off to get the pump off, of course. So with that, I'm gonna readjust, get inside as best as I can, and we'll work on removing these two trim pieces and a little bit of hardware. We're gonna start by popping up these ends of the bar. There's just little plastic or rubber boots on either side. That's gonna expose our triple square. We'll do the same thing on the other side, and then we'll remove those. M8 on either side to remove. These are triple square. Now with both of those free, we can lift up this bar out of the way. And now that should allow us to pop this plastic trim up just a bit. This just has some metal clips that hold it in place. We'll go to the other side and do the same. Nice. That's going to give us the ability to now pull this carpeting out. And we just can lift it up out of place. Looks like we're hung up on the other side here. And now that gives us access to our panel that we need to remove in order to access our belts. So let's do that now. We have 9 10mm pieces of hardware to remove, 2 nuts and 7 bolts. We'll start with the 2 nuts in the middle. All right, now we can go ahead and remove this panel. Sometimes they're a little bit stuck on, especially if they haven't been off ever or in a while. And now that we have our panel off, we have a great view of the belt. Here's our alternator, AC compressor, power steering pump, crank pulley, all that good stuff. We have this roller right here, or idler. We have this one right here with a ton of rust on it. And we have the main one at the tensioner one as well. We're gonna be replacing all 3 of those along with the belt. Make a note of the way the belt on goes first, of course, before you start taking everything apart. At the very top here, down below, if you will, you can see some of the hardware for the water pump, which we'll get to in a little bit. But for now, we're gonna grab our 24mm socket and work that top tensioner loose so we can get this belt off. We're gonna take our 24mm socket, get that situated on our tensioner here, tensioner pulley, go down, release the belt, then we can take our socket out of here, and we can pull the belt off our water pump. Obviously, if you're not replacing the belt, you can simply just pop the belt off the pump and kind of let it hang off to the side. We're gonna be replacing the whole thing, so we're gonna go ahead and just pull it off completely. All right, while we have you here, my good people, we're gonna go ahead and replace these 3 pulleys at the same time, these idlers. So each one's a little bit different, so you want to pay attention to how they come out. This one has a really long bolt, so we're gonna have to loosen the secondary alternator bolt as well so we can pivot the alternator up and get that one out. So since that one's pretty annoying, let's start with that one first. All right, so we have our first E14 up here. We're gonna go ahead and break that free. We have our E14 bit on our ratchet. You're gonna wanna pay attention to the washers and spacers that these idlers have. They're all a little bit different, and the new ones also include them. We're gonna go ahead and break this lower one free as well. That's gonna allow us to pivot the alternator up and get that long bolt out. If you watch some other videos, a lot of people are bending this metal here, and that's not really ideal. You want this plate to seal properly back later, so let's not do that. Another E14 down below. I'm just using a small extension on this one to give me some better leverage. All right, with both bolts broken loose, we're gonna start backing up this top E14 a bit with the electric ratchet, so we run out of room. I'm just gonna back it up by hand the rest of the way. And at this point, you can see it does not come. It's pretty close, but not close enough. So we're gonna take a small pry bar and just pry the alternator up a bit. Literally a hair is all we needed. All right, wiggle this out the rest of the way. If we need to pry it out more for the new one, we can. And if you know, we have this back spacer, which comes with our new pulley. And then we have a spacer up front, or a washer, and the bolt. Bolt we'll be reusing. So now that we have this one out, we're gonna leave it out for now just to give us some more room to work with the other 2 rollers here. We're gonna pick it up with doing the tensioner one now. Now the actual tensioning unit is on the other side of this part of the block. To do that, you'd have to remove the intake plenums on the engine side of things. These don't usually fail. What fails is the bearings inside the roller. So for today, we're just gonna do the roller. So we're gonna grab our 24mm socket once more and a 15mm wrench to kind of hold the bolt on the back. And we're gonna work on taking that one off now. So you can see on the back of the roller here, we have a head of a bolt. It's a little grimy looking, but this old one is a 15mm. The new one that comes with the kit is a 16. So you're gonna get your 15mm wrench on here and counter hold so we can get the 24mm nut off. We have our 24 on our socket. I'm gonna attempt to just break the bolt free first before I worry about counter holding anything. Okay, now it's starting to spin the 15 on the back. I'm going to use that to my advantage and try to prop this wrench basically over the idler plate that we have left. That's kind of why I left it in place, to use it as a brace, so I don't have to hold both of them. So I'm going to rotate it a bit more, see if I can get a better bite on that bolt. Small washer on the back of this pulley. So we have the 24mm locking bolt, if you will. There's a washer behind that. And on the back side, we have one of these. So we want to make sure we assemble our new one the exact same way. Now, the only downside to doing this is that the 15mm bolt back here does not come out. Obviously, the tensioner would have to be undone on the other side. But most people reuse these. Most people on the forums talk about this bolt, and it gets reused. So what we're going to do is just clean up the threads a little bit, and we'll apply some medium strength Loctite to it, and we'll be fine to reuse it. So with that, we're going to clean this up for one moment. We'll get our new idler in hand, and we'll pick it back up in just a moment. All right, we have our new pulley. We have our spacer in the back. This comes like this from the kit already with the bolt on it and the washer. So it's pretty easy to get these right and not mix them up. We have some medium strength on our bolt. And we're just going to really try to get this started by hand without losing our wrench that's counter holding in the back. And we're going to lose it. This is probably the most annoying part of this whole job, is going to be dealing with this tensioner. Now we have that started, we're going to grab our torque wrench and we're going to torque this down to 60 Newton meters. There we go. We'll go ahead and hit this as done. Now we're going to move on to the one right next to it, which is an E12. So we'll grab our ratchet and get that one off next. Now we're going to work on removing the last roller here that's just held in by an E12 versus the E14 that we found on the top one. Make sure you get your socket in all the way. All right, here's our old one. We're going to go ahead and match it up to one of the new ones on the table. We only have two left. They are slightly different, so just make sure you don't mix them up. We also have part numbers on the front of them. You can match them up with your new one. We have our new one. This one has a tighter back spacer than the one that goes on the long bolt for the alternator. So this one's a nice tight hole. And if we look at our old one and our last one left for the alternator bolt, this one has a wide opening on the back of the spacer. So pretty hard to mix up. They're just slightly different in size, but otherwise pretty straightforward. We're gonna get this one started in by hand again. And this E12 gets torqued down to 23 Newton meters. And now with that, we can install our top one, which goes through our alternator bolt. Right now, we're just trying to work the alternator back into place. There's a small channel that the bolt goes through on the block, and you can seat that bolt with it already going through the alternator. But right now what happens is the bushing on the back of the alternator that pulls through to tighten everything down, obviously does not go back out. So it makes it really annoying to try to get this bolt in if you remove the alternator like we have, to avoid bending the metal, which right now bending the metal sounding pretty good. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna start our bolts, get it threaded in as far as we can, giving us a little bit of play. We're gonna take a hammer and we're just gonna whack this a few times to get that bushing to go back. What I'm doing here is I'm just using a small flathead screwdriver to line up the bolt hole for this bottom E14 on the alternator. Looks like we still have to come a little bit more to the passenger side. All right, with the bolt started by hand, we're just going to start gently snugging it in. Not going to tighten it just yet. We're going to make sure our upper bolt is seated fully in its groove up here. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten the bottom alternator bolt down to 46 Newton meters. There's that one. And now we can do the top one. Wonderful. So now that we have our idlers and tensioners situated, before we start removing the 10mm bolts up top of the pump, we're going to go ahead and hop over to the engine bay side of things, remove the cap from our expansion tank, and then get to draining some coolant. All right, up here, we're gonna use this to vacuum fill from later, but opening up the cap will also allow the coolant to flow out a little bit better. So with that, we'll leave this cap off to the side, and now we're gonna climb underneath the Cayman, disconnect some hoses, and drain some coolant. All right, my good people, underneath the car, we have a plastic shield to remove in order to get access to the bottom of the thermostat and the water pump. It's held in by 3 10mm nuts along the front side and then a couple T25s. So we'll get the 3 10s out first. We have one in the middle here. And now we can see our thermostat and water pump. So we're gonna grab our pliers for these constant pressure clamps, get this one off the thermostat first, and then we'll get our catch pan situated, drain some coolant, and go from there. All right, so we're under the car. We're gonna disconnect the hose going to our water pump first. It's nice down here, easy to access. We have our catch pan situated down beneath, ready to rock and roll. We'll get as much coolant out of there as we can. That's not to say that there possibly won't be more when we actually pull the pump off of the block. So we'll keep that catch pan handy. And then once we get this one off and drained, we'll undo the thermostat hose after. Just get that out of the way. Then we have another clamp up here, just like the one we just undid for the water pump. This one's going to our thermostat, slightly bigger hose. All right, with the majority of our coolant drained, the next step is going to be to remove the thermostat. In order to get to some of the hardware, we have to remove a couple E-torques that hold a coolant pipe that runs alongside the block. That's covering some of our hardware, so we'll get that started first. We have 2 E10s underneath the exhaust manifold. Once we get those out of the way, then we can work on removing the thermostat before hopping back inside to start removing the hardware for the water pump. All right, now we're going to take the 2 E10s off for this coolant pipe. You can opt to disconnect it from the soft line here. We're going to see what happens without it. If we need to disconnect it, we will, but I'd rather not disturb it if I don't need to. A 1/4-inch ratchet would fit much nicer here with the E10 bit. We're using the 3/8 drive. It fits just enough in between the exhaust manifold here. You'll notice that there's 2 lines running through here, both held on by these E10s, one on the top, one on the bottom. This will allow us to move and manipulate both of them a little bit to get better access to the thermostat hardware. I just want to break this free a little bit more, and then we should be able to get it out by hand. With this freed up, now we can work on removing the 4 10mm bolts that hold on our thermostat. So let's reposition and get ready for that. We're going to start with the 2 bottom 10 mils. I'm just using a long extension with this wobble head, mainly just to give you all good people a better view for these bottom 2. These are fairly accessible. Again, these are 2 10mm bolts at the bottom. We have 2 more up top. This is to release the thermostat. This hardware is reusable. They're not torque to yield bolts. Our water pump kit does include new hardware for the water pump. And if you're feeling extra, these will also be the same part number. These will also be linked in the description below, should you want to change the hardware for the thermostat. With these two bottom ones taken care of, now we can hop up to the two top ones. So let's do those now, and then we should be prepared to catch our thermostat when it falls. We have the top left 10, which is quite a pain in the butt to get to with the headers in the way. We're doing our best here with the swivel socket. Just break it free first, and then it should come out no problem. This top one, you can see the way our 10 mil socket is. We have a small swivel adapter, and then we have the 1/4" ratchet sitting above the headers. It's quite annoying to get to this one, to be completely honest. I'm sure you'll find probably a better way. I've been messing with this one for a few minutes. We just want to break it free so that we can get it out by hand the rest of the way. What if I told you I have literally no clicks on this ratchet right now? Right, thermostat's gonna come out. We got our socket. This is what this looks like. Just a long extension with a small swivel at the end, and our medium length 10mm socket. And before we install our new thermostat in there, we'll clean that up. But for now, let's hop up top. We're gonna undo the top hardware on our water pump, and then we'll come down beneath and catch the pump with the last few 10 mils off. We're gonna get as many of these 10 mils out from up top with the electric ratchet just to speed things up. And then we'll probably have to switch over to the 1/4" ratchet after that. We have one more down there that we're gonna have to switch over to the 1/4" ratchet for by the crank pulley. All right, that one was not fun. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 out. I think we can get the other 3 down below. So let's head back underneath the car and get the rest out. We have 3 more 10 mils at the bottom. We're just gonna zap these out. We have our old pump out, my good people. This one has a plastic impeller or composite impeller. We're gonna go ahead and just clean up the mating surfaces really gently. There's really nothing left behind to use a metal gasket. We're just gonna clean them up with a very light Scotch-Brite, just using the same coolant to lubricate. We'll clean that up as well. We'll clean up the mating surface on the thermostat, and then we'll pick it back up in just a moment with installing our new water pump. All right, my good people, we have our new water pump ready to rock and roll. The new pump, just like the old one, has dowels on either end. The dowels are great because it lines up the pump to the block, and it also helps hold your new metal water pump gasket in place. If you remember correctly, there's 2 longer bolts that come out of the hardware for this water pump. The 2 longer ones go on either end where you have a dowel. So that's going to be sitting like this against the block. So you have one dowel over here. This one gets one of the long bolts. And you have another dowel over here. This gets one of the longer bolts. The other ones are shorter. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and feed this up against the block gently, making sure we don't bend or crease our gasket in any weird way. And we'll get a couple of these bolts started by hand. They all get torqued down to 10 Newton meters. So we'll start with what we can down here and then hop back up top and button the rest of the pump up. And if we're feeling adventurous, maybe we'll throw the thermostat in now while we're down here. We'll see, we'll see. Let's just get to it. I'm gonna take one of the 2 longer bolts, get that one started right here. Sorry for my hands. This is one of the dowel side. All right, with that one in place, we can get a few more started. We're gonna switch over to the shorter bolts. All right, so far we have the long one here at the first dowel point. We have 2 shorties here around the neck. We have our next longer one. This one we took out from above. I was able to reach in and just get it started by hand now. I might try to get it with a couple more Get a couple more turns on it with the ratchet. If we can squeeze our 1/4 inch in here. If not, we can just be patient and wait till we get back up top. But with these started down here, we're just gonna go ahead and torque them now to 10 Newton meters. Then we'll finalize the top ones. I'm not sure we're gonna be able to get our torque wrench in on that bottom right one, the one with the dowel. It's 10 Newton meters. It's not a whole lot. Really, we're just snugging down the metal gasket. So keep that in mind if you're doing the same at home. All right. With that one snug up, we have a couple left up top. So let's get back inside the car, finalize the top of the water pump bolts, and then we may as well throw on our belt while we're up there as well. So let's get to it. So we have 2 bolts left up here that we're just gonna snug up by hand and give the final torque down to 10 Newton meters. And then if you have it, you can use a paint pen or torque seal if you wanna really do it up. We have some torque seal lying around here in the shop from the race cars, so I like to use it whenever possible. All right, those 2 are buttoned down by hand. Now we're gonna go ahead and torque them down to 10 Newton meters. All right, we're gonna hold off on the belt for now just so that we can move the car and open the doors and get our cameras in here a little bit better. And arguably, I don't fit in between the lift and the car and the door. So with that, let's get back underneath. We'll button up the thermostat, get our shields back on, our hoses, and then we'll finalize it with the belt and filling this thing up with coolant. All right, down below, we're gonna feed our thermostat in. Now with this one, there is no dowel, unlike the water pump, to kind of key the gasket in and everything nicely. So we're gonna have to use the hardware to keep everything aligned and in place. So I'll get the bottom bolt started first. Again, this hardware is reusable. The thermostat gets the shortest bolts. So you have, 4 shorties, then you have another 7 in-betweeners, and then you have the 2 longest ones for the dowels on your water pump. So if you're wondering what goes where, just remember the shortest ones are for the thermostat, the medium ones are for the water pump, with the exception of the 2 doweled holes. Those take the longest bolts. And just like the water pump, this hardware also gets torqued down to 10 Newton meters. We can't really get a proper torque wrench in here with the tools that we have. So we're gonna leave it at that, nice and snug. Now we'll go ahead and do the bottom one. That one we can get a torque wrench on, and then we'll do the opposite sides. All right, now we have those situated, we can reattach our hoses. We'll start with the thermostat first, since that was the last big one we took off. There are little stops built into the thermostat here on the body that show you where the hose should be bottoming out. That way you're not guessing if you're too far in or too far out. They make it nice and easy. All right, now we have our water pump hose. Same thing, stop on either side. That shows where that should be. Usually that lines up with some notches on the hoses. You can see one right here. A lot of Porsche hoses have those that kind of help line everything up. All right, and now we can install our 2 E10s and secure the 2 coolant lines here on the side. All right, we're gonna get our 2 E10 bolts started by hand. Make sure we can get the other one in first before we go too crazy. All right, these we're just gonna snug up very gently, but same idea. If you're gonna torque them down, no more than 10 Newton meters. They're just holding 2 little plastic coolant lines in place, and they're going into the block, small fine thread. So 10 Newton meters is your max. All right, now we have that situated. The last thing we have to do under here is install our splash shield. So we're gonna go ahead and do that now so we don't have to get back underneath the car. And then we'll button up the interior and fill this in with some coolant. All right, we're gonna feed the shield back up. These kind of key into each other. Our lift arms are a little bit in the way, but we can just flex the plastic and get it in properly. Okay. Alrighty, with that is going to button up everything we need to do underneath the car. Now we're going to head back up top, get a little bit more comfy. We'll get our belt on, button up the interior, and then we'll fill this puppy with some coolant. All right, now we're going to have the fun task of feeding our new belt in, while also looking like we're not falling into the car here. Feeding the belt under the water pump. All right, we have our belt pretty much all the way on. Now we just have to slide it over or underneath this last roller. We're gonna get our 24 millimeter wrench and socket on our tensioner pulley. Bring that in, slide that over like so. Make sure our belt is nice and in all the grooves of the pulleys. There we go. Alternator looks good. Water pump looks good. Crank pulley looks good. We'll give everything a nice once over. Now at this point, depending on the job you're doing, if you're just doing the belt, now it's a great time to start the car and make sure everything looks good. In this case, because we're doing the cooling system, we're gonna go ahead and put the cover back on and fill the car with coolant so we can start it. These are pretty typically straightforward. I don't see any issues happening here, but never a terrible idea if you want to double check your work. So with that, we're gonna grab our heat shield and get that one started. We're going to feed our shield back on, just like so. We'll get all our hardware started by hand first. We're just going to snug these up using the electric ratchet. For those of you that want to torque them down, the torque spec for these is 9.8 Newton meters, so not a whole lot. We have definitely more than enough juice in this little M12 ratchet to do that. All right, with that installed, we can reinstall our carpet insulation. Now we're gonna go ahead and feed our carpet in, making sure we tuck it behind the armrest and on the sides. All right, now we can pop our top trim piece back in. And now we can install our bar that goes across the top. That's the one that's held in by 2 triple squares. Now we have our trim situated. We can fill this car back up with coolant. So we're gonna grab our vacuum fill tool. We'll get our bucket of coolant and get going with that next. All right, we have our vacuum fill tool set up. We have the end of our tool in coolant. Always keep it fully submerged. This is really the only proper way to fill these cars with coolant. You can try using the bleeder valve on the expansion tank. I personally haven't had any luck doing so, so I just stick to using the vacuum fill tool. We're going to pull suction until our gauge reaches about 25. I like to use a small towel on the end of here in case any coolant comes up still and starts aerating out of the breather here. We have our valve closed, of course. So for now, we're just going to pull the vacuum. All right, at this point, we've reached just past 25 on our gauge. We're gonna give that a few minutes, and then we're gonna pick it back up by opening up the valve and filling this thing up with coolant. All right, at this point, we wanna be sure that our hose never leaves the bottom of our bucket. We have our gallon of coolant and a gallon of distilled water in there. We're gonna go ahead and open up this valve and just fill the line up for a sec and close it right back up. I like to purge just for a second any air that may have come in via the line. All right, now I'm gonna open up the valve, keep an eye on the level, make sure we don't run out of coolant, and go until this is done. At this point, she is done drinking coolant. We had to add another gallon of distilled and coolant. So that was a total of 4 gallons of coolant, and it took about 3.6, 3.7 gallons in total. But for now, we're gonna go ahead and remove our tool, get our engine shield back on and our insulation, and wrap up this DIY. I'm gonna put our tank cap back on, make sure it's nice and snug. And we can put our engine shield back over. We have 5 T30s that hold this in place. We're gonna get them started by hand first. Then we're just gonna snug them down using the T30 on our electric ratchet. All right, and then we can put our carpeting back over. And that, my good people, is gonna conclude this DIY for today. Overall, honestly, not a bad car to work on, just very tight. And if you're a big guy or a big person like me, it gets a little bit tighter. But other than that, pretty straightforward. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave those in the comment section below. And if you like this video and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.